on one level, MMT provides a description of how the monetary system works. And this description applies for both so-called developed and developing economies. MMT shows how even less developed countries can have full employment, which I would say is even more important for poorer countries, for less developed countries, because in a sense, you can say that the US could afford to have some unemployment, but less developed countries shouldn't have that luxury.
This is the MMT podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And joining us for the first time, very excited to be speaking to Argentina-based economist and author of Modern Monetary Theory and the Employer of Last Resort. It's our pleasure to welcome Agustin Mario. Hi, Agustin. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Christian. Hi, Patricia.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
And because this is our first time talking, could you tell our listeners about your background and how you came to MMT?
Yes, I'm an economist from the University of Buenos Aires here in Argentina. And it was around, I think, December 2013. And I was wrapping up my master's dissertation. It was about the effects of a policy that was implemented here in Argentina in 2009, which is called the Universal Child Allowance, which basically completed family allowances coverage for the under 18 population. And the results of that work were showing that even after we implemented a really ambitious program and we had full coverage and a transfer payment equal to the poverty line, poverty would not be significantly reduced overall. So that led me to different policy proposals for the working age population. And that's where I found the first paper, which was Randy Ray's 97 paper, Government as Employer of Last Resort. And it was a one-way trip.
So what Warren always says, you never go back, basically.
The reason why you're here, Agustin, I guess, it's Latin America and, the developing world is often something that economists or mainstream economists or just people in general say that MMT doesn't apply to because they're not monetarily sovereign. Do you agree with this? And why do you think MMT is important to Latin America and the global South in general?
Okay. Well, no, I don't agree, first of all, because on one level, MMT provides a description of how the monetary system works, a description that differs from all other schools of thought. And this description applies for both so-called developed and developing economies. So policy prescriptions then follow from this understanding of the monetary system. And I don't mean to say that there are no differences. For example, policy space for the US is clearly greater than for Argentina. But I would say MMT shows how even, let's say, less developed countries can have full employment, which I would say is even more important for poorer countries, for less developed countries. Because in a sense, you can say that the US could afford to have some unemployment, but less developed countries should certainly or shouldn't have that luxury, I would say.
I met you through the Red MMT organization, which is mostly Spanish based, but that has a good collection of Latin American activists and economists in there, which is why I liked it so much. But one of the things that seems to be coming up a lot is that people who have become familiar with MMT, who come from Latin America, who come from the Eurozone in particular, come from MMT with a better understanding of the country's limitations that they did beforehand. Would you agree with that it helps to direct efforts in a certain direction? And what is different about being an economist within these countries, in a sense, before you have an understanding of MMT and after you have an understanding of MMT?
Okay, well, before December 2013, for me, it was much harder to be an economist because when you don't have a solid theory, it's really hard to do good economics. I always say that I was just a guy applying some econometric techniques to measure some effects of policies, and it can be interesting in itself. But once you are exposed to MMT basics, someone said it's like changing your glasses and you never see the economy same way you did before. So in a sense, that's a personal breakpoint for me. But like I said, of course, there are limitations that a country like Argentina or any Latin American country, or it's certainly not the same, but I would say the main takeaway from MMT is that even if you are a less developed country, that doesn't mean that you can't have full employment at home. Somehow that is something that is hard to understand for most Argentinian economists, and I guess most Latin American economists as well.
That must be quite frustrating for you.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of this idea about true full employment and is it possible, in your paper, MMT's Policy Prescriptions in Small and Open Economies, Addressing Some Controversies, that's the title of the paper. But in that paper, you write that, quote, it is the definition of full employment that seems to be key when discussing the job guarantee program. So what do you mean by that? How do these different definitions of full employment contrast?
Okay, what I mean is there is a literature which certainly includes many of the most renowned post-Keynesians. I mean, Sean Robinson and Nicholas Kaldor, for example, claiming that in developing economies, employment is limited by, let's say, capital equipment. Okay, so people that are employed with no or with low amounts of capital are disguised unemployed. That's what Sean Robinson called them.
Sorry to jump in. Could you just give an example of a disguised unemployed type of job?
Yeah, like the examples that are used in Robinson's text, for example, is like street vendors or shoe shine.
So is that part of the informal economy of Latin America?
Yeah, those, let's say, informal workers would not be genuine work in this sense. Maybe I am summing up the argument, but I think I'm capturing the essence of the argument. And I have to say that I find these ideas problematic, to say the least. I put it this way. As long as there are people who want to work and cannot find a job, then the economy is wasting the goods and services they could provide. Even if the techniques used by these people are obsolete or not like top-notch technology, But in any case, as long as they could do something, it's better to put them to work than just say it's not genuine work or they are disguised unemployed. But I mean, you could say it's semantics, but I don't think so. So,
yeah, it reminds me of a joke that I heard Bill Mitchell talk about, or it's apparently a macroeconomist joke. How many Harburger triangles can you fit into an Oaken gap?
Yeah, that's great.
A hell of a lot.
Well, this issue with informal workers, just to give you a bit of context, Christian, and to listeners, I mean, informal work in Latin America is a big chunk of the employment base. I mean, I don't know what the figures in Argentina are, but in Peru, they're close to 50% or have been thereabouts for the last few decades.
It's the same in Argentina. It's about 40% of the labor force. You could call them disguised unemployed, but they are doing something. So, like Patricia, you just said, it must be very frustrating. And sometimes it is frustrating, but because these arguments come from heterodox economists, which I think they are probably the best macroeconomists that we have in Argentina. But it's hard to argue about these things with them. But hopefully we can work to bring them aboard with MMTs.
I have to say, I never saw those people as unemployed. I think I would accept that they are underemployed. So something that happens in Peru, I don't know if it happens in Argentina, but whenever there is like recession, we get a lot more taxi drivers in Peru, and it seems to be like the fallback profession. And obviously, there's only so much demand for taxis, and of course, many of them are not earning enough to make a decent living. But I just saw it as a creative way for people to make some income if they couldn't find it in other sectors.
Yes, well, let's say the taxi drivers are the employer of last resort, but
Job guarantee of taxi drivers.
as you said, there is a limit to how many taxis you can have. So the economy already does this. I mean, unemployment is already a buffer stock. What we are talking about, I think, it's to build a better buffer stock of the employed. And that's all that it is, the job guarantee idea. I mean, it's not meant to solve every problem of the world, but I don't think it would make things worse. That's for sure.
Okay, because we've just brought up buffer stocks, could you just describe the way the unemployed buffer stock works, just so people who are kind of new to this have got a grounding?
Yes, I would say buffer stock policy is a policy where the government basically fixes a price, one price in the economy, and let the other prices fluctuate. And you can say that today's economists have an unemployed buffer stock, which is basically when the economy grows or expands, unemployment shrinks to a certain point, and when the economy slows down or enters into a recession, then the buffer stock of the unemployed, the number of people unemployed, grows. That's a counter-cyclical force. But let me say that it's not a very good buffer stock, because I just said that unemployment only shrinks until a certain point, and that precisely shows that the unemployed are not a good buffer stock. You know, in Argentina, for example, we had like 10 years of a growing economy, and the unemployment rate only came down to like 6% of the labor force. So it seems like there is a point beyond which that unemployment rate cannot go further down, and that in a sense that is showing that there is a limit. I would say that the unemployed are at a certain point are no longer an option for the private sector or the regular government, public sector.
So we're going to talk about the Hefaz program in a moment, but just to set the scene, could you tell us a bit about the situation in Argentina between 2001 and 2003? And I've heard Warren Mosler talk about it, and he described the technical aspect of the situation as the Argentinian peso was pegged 1-to-1 against the US dollar with a fixed exchange rate. It's possible for the Argentine government to default on its promises to pay dollars in the future because it doesn't create dollars. So with a floating exchange rate, if you've got US dollars and you're the issuer of US dollars, people decide, do they want to hold normal dollars or interest-bearing dollars? But with the peso, if you're not the issuer, if you're a private sector person, you can hold your pesos or convert to interest-bearing pesos, securities. But then there's this third option, you can convert your pesos into dollars. So the option to convert pesos to dollars competes with the option to buy peso securities. So interest rates are market determined. And so as the perceived default risk increased, interest rates on Argentinian bonds went up. And the way Warren puts it, he says that they ran out of dollars one night. And, you know, that there was a currency collapse and a deflation. And then, you know, after a particular night of unrest and violence, the government floated the peso. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's basically what happened. I was here like in December that year, and was, well, it was the greatest economic, political, and social crisis that I've seen, but I would say seen in decades, not only by me, because I was young at that time. But yes, that's basically what you just described, Christian, is just what happened. Basically, the government, it reached a point where it could no longer sustain the currency war, the peg. So the effects of that situation were really dramatic. There was a large devaluation of the peso. Large, I mean, go from 1 to 4 pesos in exchange for $1. Inflation obviously accelerated. The economy collapsed. Unemployment hiked up, and poverty rates rose to like 60% of the population. And even we had like 5 presidents in say a month or so. So the crisis was also a very deep political crisis. And one of the presidents publicly declared the default of the Argentinian public debt. And that was what was happening in December 2001 and January 2002, basically.
So, to give you a bit of context, Christian, I feel that Latin American countries have been here in that place many times, and just at different times from each other. And during the 90s, Argentina was actually one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America. What happens is something, Warren describes it really well about a fixed exchange rate constraint. Any country that has a fixed exchange rate, and then you can't pursue active kind of full employment and demand-led growth, because at some point you're going to run out of reserves, because you are relying on suppressing local demand in a sense in order to have the reserves that you need in order to maintain that peg. It's that mechanism. So Warren mentions that sooner or later you're going to run out of reserves. And then, you're going to have to slow down the economy. You're going to have huge, effectively what happened in Argentina, which is quite similar to something that happened to Peru earlier as well. I guess my question, Agustin, would be, when it comes to a country like the UK, because the UK has been in a similar position in the 70s when they had the peg again, they ran out of reserves. But they could choose whether or not to have the peg or not. Was the peg necessary for Argentina, you think? Or not?
I don't think a peg is necessary. No. I think it's like many others. It's a political choice. We would have to go a little bit back to the end of the 80s to understand the main reason why Argentina adopted such a strong currency board. And that reason is mainly because we had hyperinflation in 1999 and again in 1990. So many people is worried now that we have like 50% inflation in Argentina. But at that time, we had like, I'm not exaggerating, 5,000% inflation interannual, like annually. That's a real problem, and that's a real inflation. And we can talk about that. It was related to our foreign currency debt problems. But in any case, the currency board, of course, it helped to leave the hyperinflation behind, in a sense. You were talking about Warren, and Warren always says that the currency board was not necessary. All it was necessary was to prohibit indexation. That's another thing that the currency board sort of allowed. And that's the main reason why we had, among others, because, sometimes people say like, okay, Argentina had low inflation in the 90s because it had the currency board. I think that claim is somewhat misleading because it depends to what you peg your currency to. And that happens to be a period where the US dollar was also stable. So if the item of the buffer stock is stable, then by definition, your own currency will be stable. But if you peg your currency to gold, I can assure you that prices would have moved a lot, up and down. So it's not about having a fixed exchange rate, but it depends on what you peg your currency to,
That's great. I just wanted to back up to when you mentioned indexation. Could you mention to the listeners why Warren and, MMT people say indexation will feed inflation?
Okay, I can give you my perspective. I have talked to Warren about this, but my view is like, it's that, by definition, indexation, it's like one institutional process by which prices in the economy are indexed to somehow past inflation or what happened before. So in a sense, you have inflation because you had inflation the previous period, and that generates some kind of inertia. I don't know if that's the correct word, but
so indexation is what did they look at the statistics for the previous year or the CPI for the previous year and go, okay, prices went up by 2%. So everybody gets a 2% pay rise this year. Is that loosely what we're talking about?
Yes, basically. And, that process can get messy in a way, because if we look only at past inflation, well, it's okay. If the CPI went up like 2% last year, then let's raise wages by 2% this year. But if you have some groups in the economy, expected inflation for this year is 4%, and they ask for 4%, then you can get into what is commonly called a wage price spiral. And with inflation accelerating, I mean, that's where the situation you could say can get out of control, but as Warren always says, you can always trace inflation to prices paid by the government. Like he once said to me, at least you know where the inflation is coming from. Maybe inflation is not that bad, but it's a good thing that you know where it's coming from.
Yeah, he talks about it as the source of the price level. So if the government pays 2% more for the same thing that it paid for yesterday, and it pays 2% more today, it's just revised the value of the thing that it issues, the currency, down by 2%.
The other way I like to think about it, and maybe Agustin, you can tell me if this is similar to the way that you look at it as well. I don't know if it was Sam Levy, Christian, who told us that inflation could be seen as a unresolved conflict in the economy. Various sides competing for, I guess, the output of the economy. And I certainly like to see it as that, as different groups sort of outbidding each other, and that creating that kind of spiral, I guess. And I guess indexation, in a sense, would be like an automatic political right of a certain group to have a claim over the output. I like to see it that way, but I guess it depends on what is it that you're indexing. Because in Argentina, was it wages as well as, say, return on bonds and interest rates, or was it just the wages? How did it work?
Well, I think I tend to agree with the view that Sam Levy said and what you said, Patricia. In Argentina, it was like at the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, it was not only wages, but also, I would say, every contract. When you lose your currency, when you have 5,000% inflation a year, it's like losing your currency. And every contract, every agreement, private or public, it was sometimes even tied to the US dollar, So it's like, well, you lose your currency. Like that's what happened. And that is really a problem. So I don't mean to say inflation is not a problem. And it certainly is when it gets to those levels, But in a sense, I always say that it's not at all clear that what we mean by inflation, So commonly we are referring to an increase in a certain price index. I would even say that it's not per se an economic problem in the sense that it does not make societies poorer, as a whole. What I mean is countries grow, per capita GDP grow, and that comes with inflation, with certain inflation rates. So it's not an economic problem in that sense, but of course it can have severe distributive effects. And that's where the things that, Patricia, you were saying come into the discussion. So indexation, for example, indexing the JG wage, well, of course, it can help protect some workers, the JG workers in particular.
I'll just dive in and say, in case anybody's new here, JG stands for job guarantee. There we go. just in case.
Yeah, of course. I'm sorry. JG, job guarantee, or employer of last resort, or transition job, like Warren's calling it sometimes. But at least here in Argentina, a lot of economists, and especially mainstream economists, always say that inflation hurts poor people the most, And I say it depends. It depends. Like if you look in Argentina, for example, in between 2003 and 2015, we had inflation rates above 20%. And I would say the most people living out of social security payments could see an increase their purchasing power. So I would not make those claims that that inflation hurts poor people the most. It depends on what the government does in the distributive struggle,
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back into the history of it. So it's January 2002. I read on Wikipedia that since the supply of pesos did not meet the demand for cash, even after the devaluation, complementary currencies kept circulating alongside them. Fears of hyperinflation as a consequence of devaluation quickly eroded their attractiveness. Their acceptability now ultimately depended on the state's irregular willingness to take them as payment of taxes and other charges. So, yes, could you tell us about these other complementary currencies? And that's a very MMT insight, isn't it? That the acceptability of a currency that really depends on what the state's willing to accept as payment of taxes and fines and fees, and as the Wikipedia says, other charges.
Yes, I think Wikipedia is right. I would say it is always the case that the currency is accepted ultimately because you can use it to make payments to the issuer. And what was happening in Argentina by the end of 2001 was that the government was constraining its fiscal policy big time, desperately trying to sustain the peg, So it was really, cutting public expenditures. And in that context, many local governments or subnational governments, we have provinces here or state in the US.
Sometimes we say municipalities.
Many governments started, simply like issuing their own complementary currencies, their own currencies, because they were simply not able to pay wages, So they were having trouble just to keep functioning. We had many different complementary currencies in many provinces. And it's a nice example of, like you said, of MMT's insights because, for example, the Buenos Aires province, which is the most important province here in Argentina, and had the Patacón, the Patacón, and everybody was surprised in a sense that it worked, but it simply worked because the government was accepting it in payments to itself, at par value equal to the peso. So that made the trick. I think that also helped the recovery that started in late 2002.
And it really does underline this thing that people talk about possibly more in the US than they do in the UK, but the policies that, politician X is pushing are going to devalue the dollar. It's going to undermine the credibility of the dollar. People won't trust the dollar. They'll move out of the dollar based on trust, whereas what you've just outlined is, none of this works on trust. We make sure that you need the currency.
Yes, it's about coercive taxation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Your currency is as good as your ability to collect taxes.
Yeah.
So, Agustin, you mentioned that there was this fear of hyperinflation as a result of the devaluation. I mean, there was inflation, but there was no hyperinflation in 2001, was there?
No, not even close to that. The exchange rate made a big jump, from 1 to 4 initially, and then stabilized around 3 to 1. So that's 300 or 200% depreciation of the peso. But inflation, even if it was accelerating, it never got to those figures. There are many explanations to that, but I think, when you have probably 40% of the labor force unemployed, then you have a big margin to grow without affecting the price level.
I guess we should turn the corner now and ask, how did the idea for the Jefes Y Jefas program in Argentina come about?
Well, it came about in this context, of this crisis that I was talking about. It was implemented in April 2002, a couple of months after this big crisis. It's fair to say that it was conceived as an emergency response to the crisis. They were not thinking on a permanent policy or something like that. I think it was conceived at least initially as an emergency response.
People who are kind of MMT conversant these days are saying, no, this shouldn't be a crisis response. We can either have a permanent level of unemployment or we can have a permanent level of job guarantee employment, and hopefully a low level of job guarantee employment as well. But so I guess that's one of the differences. We're kind of about to ask you about how did the Hefaz program differ from, what we would consider to be the MMT job guarantee as written about by many people. I guess chief among them would be Pavlina Chernova, but I guess that's one of the key differences, isn't it?
Yes, I've read Pavlina saying that unfortunately, these programs, they usually are implemented in times of crisis. And in a sense, it would be much easier to implement them when the economy is growing for many reasons. But for example, what happened in Argentina in this context of a big crisis, the program grew very rapidly, and it reached around 2 million participants. That's more than 10% of the labor force a year later.
A lot of the informal workforce as well?
Yes, for sure. Mainly informal workers, mainly people that have not completed high school education, mainly women. That was the profile, the main characteristics of the participants. There was some surprise for the people that were implementing it and that were working in the Ministry of Labor, because the program was limited to the head of the household, so to one member per household. I would say the rational strategy for many households was usually the male adult would keep working or looking for work in the informal sector, and the woman would participate in the program. And the spending of the program was around 1% of GDP. So it was a big push for the recovery of the economy, the program in itself. But as Christian said, there were important differences with respect to what a JG, a job guarantee, would be. Like I just said, it was limited to only one person per household. Not only that, it also had a deadline for enrollment. So it was not a permanent program. And many participants of the 2 million, many of them were not actually working for many reasons. You can say administrative reasons in a sense, because they were not expecting that many people to the program. So it was a big problem that they had to look something to do for all those 2 million people. And that's why I think it's better to start these programs when the economy is growing.
When you say that people didn't work under the Hefaz program, do you mean they took the job, they took the wage, but they just didn't show up to work?
I mean that they took the wage because the payment was credited to their accounts, let's say. But in some cases, there were nothing for them to do, for this administrative or logistical problem that I'm considering. That's a reason, yeah.
So it wasn't even that they would show up at a workplace or anything because the jobs weren't designed.
Yes. That's one of the reasons why when we think in some practical aspects, that's a reason, for example, why we may want to do phased-in implementation. Like think about in 2 or 3 years and start slow so that you don't have this kind of discrimination of some people working and other not working, which eventually will lead to the loss of popularity in the policy and all that we have been talking about.
It's a good warning from history, isn't it? How to make sure that you bring the people with you in the program.
Yes, I know that there's some discussion about this. Some MMT proponents claim that setting a low initial wage could help avoid the program being flooded with people. I would prefer to establish a decent wage or good job and have like these phased-in schemes, because then you avoid these arguments that say that JG jobs are bad jobs and all that. So I think that's something that politically you want to avoid.
You establish the intentions from the beginning, and then you bring everybody in a phased way.
Yeah, in a way that you can say in 2 or 3 years we will have this program working totally universal and open, but we do have to build some capacities, let's say, and that takes some time.
And was it locally administered, or were the jobs centrally created? How did that work? Who said what the jobs were?
Basically, well, at the beginning it was mainly centralized, but as the program grew, they kind of had the need to start decentralizing it. So they started decentralizing it to local governments and also not-for-profit organizations. But it's fair to say that after, in May 2003, there was a new government here in Argentina, and the strategy was to start phasing out the Jefes program because it had lost some popularity, you may say, because of some of the things that we were discussing. And there was a shift in social policy towards, let's say, a combination of unemployment insurance and family allowances, like a combination of those two. So many years later, in 2009, we implemented another program called Argentina Trabaja, which would translate as Argentina Works. That was a smaller program, but it was certainly much more decentralized. And I think that's an advantage of this scheme, because it needs to be highly decentralized to work smoothly.
It saves one person from having to think of all the jobs, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. Basically, what you need, I think, is not-for-profit organizations proposing projects. The federal government should basically control that the things are being done, in a sense.
Can we just get really specific about what the Hefaz program looked like on the ground? Was it 4 hours a day that they were guaranteeing to any head of household? Was that what it was? And also, could you say, what kind of work were people doing? I know that Warren likes to talk about when MMTers are asked by skeptics, oh, well, what kind of work will people be doing? Will they be digging ditches and filling them in again? And, as a sort of slight, and MMTers respond, oh, no, there's loads of stuff out there that people can do, and start launching into a list of jobs. And Warren prefers to say, look, what they're doing is transitioning. The point is that through taxation, through modern money systems, using a tax system to create unemployment for the further purpose of provisioning the state, we've created a bunch of unemployed people, and then we haven't employed them all. We've left residual unemployment in the system. So Warren, being characteristically diplomatic, says, so, let's just say the government made a mistake. So we're going to fix the mistake with a job guarantee. So the idea is, government's already decided that they don't want these people to work for the government. Otherwise, they would have given them a job. So, the government's fully provisioned. The private sector doesn't want to hire these people. So if they become long-term unemployed, it's going to be very hard for them. Employers don't like to employ unemployed people. So I call it a transition job, because we're trying to transition those people back into the private sector. And so Warren prefers to say, it's a transition job. Just if anybody asks you, what are these people going to be doing? Just say transitioning. But I think people, when you say that, people feel that you are dodging the question. Patricia and I have talked many times about how we envisage how it would play out in, say, the UK, and non-profits, I think, would come into it, stuff like that,
Especially non-profits in a time of emergency, I think is quite important, because as Agustin said, you're in an emergency, you have a huge demand for this program, and it may be difficult to think of the jobs, and just a way of speeding that process might be to get the non-profits involved, I guess.
And the non-profits have already proved that there's a need for this kind of work to be done. It's just not, under current conditions, something that the profit motive is going to get done. So it makes perfect sense to, include them in the decision making. But anyway, sorry, this was a long-winded way of getting into, am I right about the 4 hour a day thing? And also, what kind of work were the people in the Hefaz program doing?
Okay, first I'll try to answer about the specifics of the Jefes program, and then let me go back to transitioning argument and all that. Yeah, it was supposed to be 4 hours a day, but for many reasons, many of the participants did not work. So it was like a mixed scheme, I would say. Some people worked 4 hours a day, and in reality, others did not work at all. And that's part of the reason why the program lost popularity, because if people don't like this kind of, I don't know how you say, favoritism.
Yeah, favoritism.
Or discrimination. I don't know if that's not a good thing for a public policy. The projects included basically infrastructure projects, construction projects, also environmental projects like, I don't know how to say it, but...
say it in Spanish if you want.
Reciclado, no sé cómo se dice, Patricia. But
Recycling.
Recycling, okay.
I think Fadel would probably call it environmental cleanup.
Okay, environmental cleanup. They were really, really interesting projects because they were already being done by not-for-profits. So, in a sense, you could say that you're just scaling up things that some organizations were already doing. It's like you don't have to invent anything. You just have to rescale some useful activities that are already being done by not-for-profit organizations. I also think that, like Warren says, you can just say they are transitioning. I agree with this idea that the government made a mistake if you see unemployment in a sense. But like I said a while ago, I believe Warren would agree because it's in his 1997 paper, Full Employment and Price Stability. It may be some point beyond which you cannot reduce the size of the problem, the size of the job guarantee, simply by reducing taxes or increasing other public spending. It's not that simple. And it's the reason why you need a job guarantee, because if not, you could just get to full employment by using traditional fiscal policy. And it's also the reason, I would say, what do you want people to do? Like become a better alternative to the private sector. That is transitioning, And the reality, at least in Argentina, and I believe in most Latin American countries, the reality is that there is a part of the labor force that is not really an alternative to the private sector. So you have to try to do something so that they become an alternative, and employers can reach out for the JG pool and hire those people instead of, like they currently do, competing for the already employed workers and competing through wages, increasing wages before full employment. That's what we observe with today's policies.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question about, you and I were in a panel recently in the Democratizing Work, and it was a pleasure being there with you and with other people from Spain and Latin America. But I remember you mentioning about the Argentinian program that things may have been different if Argentina had introduced this Jefes Y Jefas program. They did it right after they defaulted on the foreign debt, and that things might have been different if it had not done that. Can you explain a little bit more about it? Do you remember?
I really don't know what I said, Patricia, but...
Well, do you think it would have been different? Was there some advantage that Argentina had because it had decided to default?
If Argentina had not defaulted, it would not have had the policy space, fiscal space necessary to pursue domestic full employment or demand expansion policies like it did. So it was a necessary condition, at least, for that to happen. It's important to remember that Argentina publicly declared the default of its public debt and did not make any payments for 3 years. It started repaying its debt with a huge discount. I don't know if it's the right word, but
it managed to restructure the debt.
Yeah, big time.
Can I just jump in and ask, when we say defaulted on its debt, are we saying that it's debt to the IMF or debt to all bondholders?
It's always the IMF.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And in that moment, we declared that we were not going to keep paying any foreign currency denominated debt, including the IMF. And indeed, we did not pay until the end of 2005 after restructuring. The IMF debt, we paid, I think it was like 10 billion in US cents, $10 billion. That was in 2006. President Kirchner paid $10 billion and paid all the IMF debt. And so, in a sense, we were free from the IMF until most recently we came back to that's we can talk about that. But going back to the question, I think not paying the public debt for 3 years gave us a lot of policy space to recover the economy. So that's a very important thing that is sometimes forgotten in today's discussions.
And just while we're talking about the IMF, There's a quote that I dug up from the president at the time, Nestor Kirchner, in a speech at the UN General Assembly on the 21st of September 2004. So Kirchner said, an urgent, tough and structural redesign of the International Monetary Fund is needed to prevent crises and help in providing solutions. And he's kind of implicitly referred to the fact that the intent of the original Bretton Woods system was to encourage economic development. And then he goes on to say that the IMF today must change that direction, which took it from being a lender for development to a creditor demanding privileges. So, yeah, I mean, he pretty much nailed the problem there.
Yes.
Did they listen?
I guess it makes a difference, as Christian, you've said, as Christian said in the speech, what the money borrowed is doing.
Yeah.
And I feel that sometimes in Latin America, we need a lot of equipment. We don't produce this technology that we need to run the economy more efficiently, perhaps. And if it's used for that purpose, it makes more sense than sometimes I feel that some Latin American leaders have used the borrowing not as a means of developing anything, but as a means of tying the country up to a sort of a certain sense of discipline that they've got in their heads. Would you agree with that, Agustin, or am I being too harsh?
No. I agree, completely agree. And it goes even further because a lot of economists and the people in general, they really believe that we need for example, US dollars to pay for things here domestically. All the IMF or World Bank or International Development Bank are doing functionally is basically allowing us to appreciate our exchange rates for some time until we run out of those dollars. So, like you said, I'm not against borrowing in a foreign currency per se. It could help you. Like we MMTers know, imports are a real benefit and exports are a real cost. So anything that we can do to increase imports is a good thing. But it's important to know that somehow, in a certain point, you will have to repay this debt, foreign currency denominated debt. So personally, I lean towards trying to avoid this kind of borrowing because I think in the Argentinian case, you can explain large volatility of the exchange rate basically by this borrowing. So I think it's doing more harm than it helps, but it could be different. I'm not exactly sure how, but if you use it for import substitution and all those industrial policies and all that, it could work. So I'm not categorically against it, but I'm somehow accepting.
So in your paper, Agustin, you write, some authors claim that full employment policy could have contractionary effects. Could you tell us about these claims and what they're based in and what the counterclaims are?
Yeah, I would say what many heterodox economists here in Argentina are worried about is inflation and particularly exchange rate inflation. So the argument goes that if you implement a job guarantee through different channels, but the result will be currency depreciation. And currency depreciation would generate a recession and shrink the economy. Basically, that's the external constraint argument. And I think it certainly is an important consideration. I do think that Latin American countries and less developed countries in general have an external constraint in the sense that they are limited in what they can import. Okay, Argentina cannot import, may not be able to import everything it wants. And this can be a severe problem if you don't have access to some basic goods and certain technology. That can certainly be a severe problem. So if you implement a JG, like I said, the currency could depreciate as a result. But what I always say, and what I said on the paper, is that if the depreciation or any other reason brings about a recession, well, the JG size, the JG pool will grow, sustaining full employment and putting a floor to the recession. I think most of the problem in this discussion is that the different policy prescriptions of MMT are considered separately, So when they talk about the JG, they don't link it to the floating exchange rate. And if they criticize floating exchange rate, they forget about the JG. So it's critical to take the policy prescriptions as a whole. That's why the title of the paper. Yeah?
Got it. Yeah, because we often talk about there is only one policy prescription in MMT, and that is to implement a job guarantee, or recognize that the unemployment rate is a policy choice, and therefore why not have it at zero? But obviously we're saying that in the context of if you have a floating exchange rate, so we're already presuming floating exchange rate.
So I guess a floating exchange rate is an implicit policy prescription.
And obviously zero interest rate policy as well.
Yeah.
Yes, but you may like to have some kind of fixed exchange rate or some kind of exchange rate target. But the problem is that eventually it conflicts with the full employment goal. So maybe the spending that is necessary to achieve full employment will conflict with your exchange rate goal. And then you have to choose. And that's where I think the policy choice is obvious, but for some people it may not be obvious, and they may prefer to have people unemployed so that they can have let's say an overvalued exchange rate. Those are political discussions,
I just wanted to pull out this passage from your paper. It's a great passage. As Mitchell and Mosler said, the implication is that the buffer stock of unemployed serves a dual role: to stabilize the inflation rate and to stabilize the current account position. A further implication is that the deprivation suffered by those in the buffer stock of unemployed is required to allow those currently in employment to enjoy an array of attractive and relatively cheap imported goods and services. The optimality of this position is not established in economic theory. I think that's a good point that needs hammering home.
Yes, it's hard to add anything to that because it's the clearest statement that I could find about this discussion. Of course, like I just said, some groups may see their situation worsened by this policy, but the unemployed people cannot get any worse than where they are today. So it's a distributive thing in the end.
I just wanted to ask you something that we asked Nodongo as well when he was here talking about Africa, and we asked Fidel as well when he was here talking about Latin America. Since all of Latin America share a lot of, we're all in it together in a sense. We all share the same problems. What do you think that the immediate obstacles right now are for the job guarantee? And do you have hope that the job guarantee might become discussed more openly in Latin America? Or maybe it already is in Argentina from 2001, it carries on. What do you think? Are you hopeful for that prospect?
Well, I am hopeful because I am an optimistic by nature. But to tell you the truth, I would say there are economic obstacles and political obstacles. About political obstacles, it's not my area of expertise, but I think in every country, we should try to push for political movements to include, for example, the JG in their policy agenda. Here in Argentina, I would say that some political movements are more likely, even if we are not there yet. I'm hoping for some political movements to be able to discuss these policy options more than others. But again, it's not my area of expertise. The main economic obstacle right now in Argentina is the public debt denominated in foreign currency. That is the main reason why right now it's hard to implement a policy like the job guarantee in a very specific sense, not in a broad sense, but in a very specific sense. MMTers, we always say that the issuer of a currency can buy whatever is for sale in its currency. So if the Argentine government, for example, finds willing sellers, the government could buy the US dollars to repay the debt in principle. But however, this spending would not be based on a price rule. So the government would not be in a position to set the price, and also it could not set the quantity of pesos spent, because the amount of dollars that it has to repay is, let's say, a fixed amount. So this entails a very high risk of inflation. And as I talked briefly about the Argentine hyperinflation in the late 80s, hyperinflation tend to be associated with foreign currency debt crisis. So that is the main risk that I see, the main obstacle that I see for implementing these kind of policies. So what I mean is that once a country like Argentina or any other country has borrowed in a foreign currency, it is really not hard to see why it has strong incentives to try to control or target its exchange rate. And as we just said, having an exchange rate target or trying to control your exchange rate usually means domestic unemployment. So I see a big obstacle there.
Right. Thank you so much, Agustin. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you. You've been very patient with my English.
No, not at all. You've been patient. So before we wrap up, I'll be sure to link to your Twitter feed in our show notes, Agustin, so that people can stay current with what you're up to. But are there any other places you'd like listeners to visit online or in the real world, or any organizations you think they might be interested in checking out, or any events coming up that we need to put in our diaries?
My Twitter is the best way to reach me and reach my work at Agu_Mario.
Okay, I'm going to spell it out for everybody. It's at AGU_MARIO. That's Agustin's Twitter handle. There'll be a link to that Twitter account in the show notes for this episode. And also, I'll put a link in the show notes for Red MMT as well.
Yes.
For Patricia, there's a book as well.
Yes. As everybody knows, English is Agustin's second language. He is incredible at writing books in Spanish, particularly. So if there's any Spanish-speaking people out there who would like a really good introduction to MMT and particularly the job guarantee as an inflation control mechanism, Agustin has a book out which is called in Spanish Teoría del Dinero Moderno y Empleador de Última Instancia, cómo la Argentina puede usar el pleno empleo para controlar la inflación. And it's on sale. I believe it's on the Red MMT website, Agustin. Am I right?
Yes.
There is actually a link in your Twitter biography to where you can get hold of that book as well.
Yes, it is. It's a link to the university that published the book. Yeah.
Right.
And there'll be a link in our show notes as well. So that's a great place to leave it. Once again, we've been talking to Agustin Mario, economist and author of Modern Monetary Theory and the Employer of Last Resort. I'll link you to where you can find his work in the show notes for this episode. But for now, thanks once again so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Agustin Mario.
Thank you so much, Christian and Patricia. It's been a pleasure.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.